Alright, today we're going to answer an important question. Mid-range versus flagship. How much difference is there? Now, I know you guys are most likely buying the mid-range. Don't act like you have that flagship money. Nobody does. It's okay. It is the sensible thing to buy the mid-range. That's why I covered the OnePlus 13R, even though I had time with both the 13 and the 13R. And in my time, I did the one thing I thought most of you would be curious about. Now, I know there are other differences. You buy the flagship, you can put it under motor oil and you can put it in the dishwasher. I get it. No one cares. Maybe some people care. You know what I know you care about? The camera. Because every time you're buying a mid-range, you're wondering, should I have bought that top of the line flagship phone with the flagship cameras? And am I screwing over my children's memories just by skimping out on a few $100s and not getting the best quality images I can get? Well, we're about to find out. And I think some of these results are actually going to be very surprising. Let's get into it. Now, the first thing I notice when I see the daytime shots is the color science. There is a difference. The OnePlus 13R generally will seem a little more contrasty, will seem to boost certain colors unnaturally, especially greens I've noticed. Take a look at this picture where you've got just a lot of greenery. It just looks unnaturally green. The 13R does that, the 13 does not seem to. But generally speaking, from a detail point of view, I'm not seeing too much of a difference. Yes, if I pixel peep here and there is a little bit of a difference, but if I'm being honest, the 13R with its post-processing brings up those details and the effect is quite convincing. But here's the real big issue. While the color science does shift and the 13R is definitely not color accurate, there's usually a reddish sort of warm tinge to daylight shots. And if you are taking shots of a fluorescent lit room, like with a tube light or something like that, then the 13R tends to cast a greenish hue around the light. I'm not sure why, but it does. And while it might be noticeable to me, may not be noticeable to most people. Like on the 13, this doesn't exist. But you know what really will be noticeable? Skin tones. On the 13R, skin tones are noticeably yellower and a little more contrasty and a little more off. If you really look at someone's face, it doesn't look like it's the right skin tone and complexion, and there's something really wrong there. Taking the same shot on the OnePlus 13 really shows you what that person actually looks like. The skin, I mean, that Hasselblad partnership definitely seems to have paid off, because the end result is much more convincing, much more human, and much less likely to send you to the doctor checking if you've got jaundice. So there you have it. Day shots. Honestly, detail-wise, I don't really have an issue one over the other. There's definitely a lower amount of graininess in the OnePlus 13 shot. But unless you're pixel peeping, I have to say the 13R looks reasonably detailed with all that post-processing going on. What about portrait shots though? Okay, so here's two examples of portrait shots, and the reason I'm taking these two examples is one, to check the portrait effect, but also HDR performance. Now, controlling the highlights is a pretty darn important part of taking a photo, especially smartphones with their post-processing need to get this right. The 13R gets it decently right, but consistently so. You can see over here the sunlight in the window falls off pretty quick. There's a bright spot and then it just sort of falls off into a not bright spot. But if you look at the same shot on the OnePlus 13, the flagship, you can see a much more gradual roll off of the highlights, which is the bright spot. It just gradually rolls off to a not bright spot, and that is much better HDR handling. That's much more information preserved at the bright ends of the photo. Another thing you notice between these two photos is that the mid-range phone generally has a more contrasted look, especially where there are shadows around your facial features, whereas in the OnePlus 13, the larger sensor captures more light and captures just more detail in general. Detail on the face does not look different between the photos, but the way the shadows gradually fade away to the lighter parts, that happens when you have a larger sensor and you just have better optics in general. Having said that, for most people, it's not going to be much of an issue, because again, that post-processing is doing wonders and the OnePlus 13R is coming out with pretty convincing results. Now, color science apart, because we've already talked about that, how does it actually cut out the portrait? The answer? Both of them do pretty well. If you look closely at the hair though, you start to realize that the OnePlus 13 is putting in more effort. There's more processing going on. It does a better job of cutout, not perfect, but a significantly better job of the overall cutout. And that is something that, you know, if you're taking portraits of someone with a lot of curly hair or just a lot of hair in all directions, anything complex, I feel the OnePlus 13R will start to show its limitations, whereas the 13 will be able to give it just that little bit of extra processing power and a little bit more thinking power. But in most cases, again, the 13R's results are certainly not bad and are certainly convincing. Also, I did notice that even on the mid-range, the 13R, the way the background blur presents itself is more gradual. So the subject is in focus and things around the subject are in focus, and then it gradually goes off into that background blur. Kudos to OnePlus for doing the processing reasonably well on the mid-range. Could it be better? Yes. But for a lot of people, I think the results are pretty decent. That being said, there is another issue with the flagship, the OnePlus 13. Here's another two shots displaying the HDR capability, or the capability of managing highlights, between the 13 and the 13R. And over here you actually see the 13R doing a relatively natural and better job. That is not the HDR performance we saw from the previous photo. And here's another example of a photograph where the 13R controlled the highlights nicely and evenly, but the 13, the flagship, gave you this. It's really odd, but while the OnePlus 13 does give great results, it seems to be a little bit inconsistent in the way it controls highlights across shots, and that is definitely not something you want in a flagship phone. This is a little bit worrying, and I hope a firmware update or something patches this, but for now, you can get much better results from the 13, but sometimes you just don't. Now, let's take a look at the night shots. From the main sensor, while both cameras do handle light and darkness a little bit differently, I can't really fault one over the other. Like, I think the OnePlus 13 and the 13R actually give pretty good results from their main sensors, even at night. Now, the 13 does control the highlights a little bit better and push out that detail just a little bit better, but that is only if I'm pixel peeping. This is where I expected the results to be noticeably better on the OnePlus 13, but for some reason they're not. We interrupt this video to remind you to hit that like button. It helps. It just helps, okay? Also subscribe, but if you want to become a member and support the channel, you get giveaways. Every once in a few months I give away like earphones or headphones or something. Consider it. It's not much, but it helps and it's really cool. Okay, back to the video. When it comes to telephoto, that's where the OnePlus 13 does pull ahead, because while the 13R can do 2x, it's okay, it's not bad at all. The 13 can do 3x and 6x, and that's where things get way better. So there's no competition, but that's an unfair comparison. One's hardware is just better. Now, from the ultra wide, neither photo is fantastic, but it's not bad. It's certainly serviceable. But again, what I'm seeing is the 13R and 13 are both reasonably comparable. Even if there's a slight detail bump in the 13, it's certainly not showing itself too much in the ultra-wide camera. If you look at that neon sign, generally speaking, on the 13, it's a little more realistic. It controls the highlights a bit more. But we're nitpicking here. I mean, the 13R does look very convincing. I am very surprised with this, because you're about to see where the difference really lies, and that is in video taking. While on photos, I'll admit the detail wasn't entirely obvious. When you're taking video, it is noticeably better on the OnePlus 13. Video tends to be smoother and every single frame has more detail. If you pause the video of the OnePlus 13R and the OnePlus 13 at the same spot, you will see always more detail on the 13, and in general, video does seem better. However, the EIS jitter, the background jitter you see when you're walking with the camera, that seems to be on both cameras. So I don't know what it is, but OnePlus really needs to address this issue. This is unacceptable on a flagship. I could accept it on mid-range. I don't like it, but you could accept it. But on a flagship, this should absolutely not be the case. So first, here's a video on the OnePlus 13R. It looks pretty good. The colors look reasonably nice. You've got light areas, you've got dark areas. The dark areas, like the child's face, is reasonably well exposed. Everything looks fine. Looks a bit contrasty, but it's nighttime. Here's what the flagship looks like. Everything is better across the board. There's a little more detail across the board. The colors are nicer, but also now look at the child's face and how it's exposed, and the color science all comes together to create a much better overall image. And that, I think, is where the OnePlus 13 really pulls ahead. Yes, the post-processing for a single photos makes the 13R surprisingly competitive. But where this really comes together is where you're taking multiple frames every second, i.e. video. And in video, I mean, if you're a content creator of any sort, it's simple. Just go for the OnePlus 13. It's just better. It just is. Now, despite my issues with the EIS jitter in the background, I have to say, when you're handheld and moving around, walking with it, while the OnePlus 13 wasn't fantastic with the stabilization, it was significantly better than the 13R. And also, one thing I noticed was that there were more frames skipped on the 13R. Every once in a while, you'd see one frame skip, you'd see a little bit of an irregularity. So again, the video of the 13 is noticeably better. And finally, here is a video of a night scene where I'm using the main camera and then zooming in. Video looks nice on the 13R. Highlights on the lamps are controlled. The shadow has some detail. It's a bit noisy, but it's not bad. On the 13, however, look at how these lights pop. I think by default it went into HDR video recording or Dolby Vision video recording. I don't know what it was, but man, everything popped better. I felt like those lights were actually incandescent. And yes, of course, there was more detail and just more information in the shadows across the board. I mean, this was such a nice video taking experience on the 13 compared to the 13R. So what is my main takeaway from this entire thing? In broad daylight, my biggest issue is not detail or the amount of background blur and whatnot. Those are all slightly better on the OnePlus 13, but in some cases the detail actually looks like it's better on the 13R because of all that post-processing. And I'm not one to argue with those results, because for most people, they're going to see that and they're going to say, hey, that's a good image. But that Hasselblad partnership has really come in clutch, because without that, you can see what color science OnePlus was working with the 13R, and it's horrendous. It is terrible, especially when it comes to people's skin tones. That's a problem. Having said that, what the heck happened to the HDR performance of the OnePlus 13? While the OnePlus 13R might not get the color right, whatever it does consistently. That is a point actually in the 13R's favor. At night, both cameras were surprisingly comparable. And that is not a good thing for the flagship. Again, if you're close up to someone's face with the 13, it's going to give you better background blur, it's going to give you more detail in the shadows. There are a lot of situations where the 13 will be better, but there are a lot of situations where the 13R is just not that far behind. But where things really fall apart is the video. It's the video. The OnePlus 13 is just better, smoother, more detailed video with better stabilization across the board. If you're just a regular person, honestly, you could do just fine with the 13, right? It is surprisingly good. But I would actually look in the market for other manufacturers that have better color science. What did you think? Which one did you buy? And do you regret your decision? Never regret your decision. Just live life. Okay, if you want more content like this, then please tell me so I know to make it. But also hit that like and subscribe button, because look, we have to, okay? People forget. Thank you. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you. And I'll see you in the next one. Stay happy, stay peaceful, stay colorful. Namaste.